Welcome to the Eyes on Privacy podcast. This is episode 20 joining us this month, but he should be back next month. And this month we're going to get freaky about the freak vulnerability. So Keith is going to start out and give kind of a history lesson to all of us about basically how we got to where we are today.
Okay. So factoring RSA export keys is really about an exploit that was discovered in the SSL TLS protocols, and what this basically does is allow a negotiation sequence as you're trying to establish the TLS or SSL connection. And this was discovered by a group from several sources, but there's a Karthikeyan Bhagarvan, and I'm sure I butchered his name or her name. I apologize, but they are part of INRIA in Paris and the MyTLS team. And there are some a report prepared by some computer scientists at University of Michigan, and they have, if you go to freakattack.com, there's kind of a description of the issue and how prevalent it is. What's interesting with this one is it takes advantage of what we call export-grade cipher suites. And so here's the history lesson. Many years ago, when we started having browsers, and browsers needed a way to securely send information, SSL was born, if you will. And SSL 2.0 basically became the version available in the Netscape browser that a lot of people started using when they wanted to transfer sensitive information. Well, at the time, cryptographic export regulations basically prevented the export of high-grade or very strong crypto. And so this kind of left these U.S. companies in a little bit of a bind because they wanted to provide strong crypto for their customers, and yet they could not export that same crypto outside of the country. And so what the compromise was were to create cipher suites that had weak crypto in it, and that would be what you would export and make available to everybody, and the idea being that the NSA could crack it, that these keys were not long enough, and that the NSA, if dedicated enough computing resources to it, could crack these smaller key sizes and any crypto that was used, or any encrypted communications that were used with these lower grade, if you will, cipher suites. And so we had 512-bit export grade keys for RSA, and then we also had 40-bit RC4 symmetric key ciphers, so the raw bits that were encrypted were using 40-bit crypto, and sometimes they used 56-bit DES. I think that was an option as well. That was when DES was reaching kind of its end of life on the government side. And so these export-grade cipher suites were basically the norm, and what were required for the longest time anytime you wanted to export crypto as part of your software products. Eventually, and I'm trying to remember exactly when, but eventually that rule kind of went away, and then strong crypto became available everywhere. So no longer did manufacturers have to have two versions of their software kits or even their hardware. They could provide one, and it could all be strong crypto. But even though the need for export-grade cipher suites went away, the export cipher suites themselves did not, and they were still part of a lot of SSL TLS libraries. And I'll just to point out a little thing here. You may not realize this, but the SSL protocol had an option to not encrypt at all. It's called the null option, basically, and it would basically not encrypt any packets at all. And that one kind of was used for testing purposes, and eventually I don't believe it's part of SSL v3 or TLS anymore, but in SSL 2.0 certainly that was an option. Anyways, so the cipher suites that had these weak and small length crypto keys that were used, were still hanging around even today. And so this group created a toolkit called SMAC, which was really a state machine trying to attack TLS libraries. And this is how they discovered this particular problem, because they could basically insert themselves in the clients and the servers to use these much weaker keys. And so this is when this became a problem. And this was announced as part of a fix to the OpenSSL library back, I think, in January or much earlier this year. And it wasn't really thought to be a big problem because nobody thought these older cipher suites were still available. And it turns out they were. And so part of the freakattack.com site went out and basically polled a bunch of servers to see which ones had these older cipher suites. And it turns out, and I'm looking at the number, looking for the number here, it's around, it's since March 3rd, when they changed it in March 3rd, 26.3% of HTTPS servers had these particular export grade cipher suites. It's now down to about 11.8%, according to the website. So it's gone down quite a bit. But 26, a quarter of web servers out there had this problem. And so as people have upgraded their libraries and switched their servers around, this has gone down a little bit. But there's still a problem on the client side as well, because a lot of the clients still had these older cipher suites as well, and they were also having a problem with this as well. So anyways, this freak attack is really about a man in the middle, but the man in the middle part happens during the cipher suite negotiation. And it was fairly common even on clients such as Internet Explorer and Chrome, Safari, the stock browsers in Android and iOS. They all seem to have this particular problem. And it was a little more prevalent than people imagined. So that's kind of the basic issue here. The problem is if you can force a client to use the weaker crypto, given the computing power today, you can basically brute force search the keys in an attempt to break the key and discover the unencrypted text. And so that's really the issue, where if you're using a 1024-bit key or a 2048-bit key, it's exponentially larger search space that you have to go through to find the original unencrypted text. But with the export ones, you're basically can marshal a lot of resources through Amazon Web Services, for example, and do some key cracking that way. And that's really the issue, is you assume you're safe, but you're using weak crypto, and that can be cracked reasonably easy for at least not a lot of money, basically.
Right, and I'm sure the NSA could do it in a matter of minutes.
Probably.
Now, I mean, it wasn't mentioned in any of the articles, but is this a vulnerability that essentially could have been used by the NSA to gather information, especially since a lot of the export-restricted countries were ones that would potentially be targeted by them?
I don't think we have any evidence that they were exploiting this weakness. It might be something that they were aware of. But there's nothing that we've seen that would indicate that. I mean, it's really hard because the key negotiation or the cipher suite negotiation piece, I don't believe there's any logs for that. So it'd be really hard to go back through logs and try to figure out if somebody was trying to do a man-in-the-middle attack on you and force you into using lower strength crypto. I don't know that we would see that.
So even if you were vulnerable to it, you probably couldn't go back in logs and detect if it was used.
I don't think you could.
So you just kind of have to assume it was, I guess. And then it's best to just change information, change passwords, change things that were exposed, could potentially have been exposed.
Yeah, I suppose if you're concerned about the NSA, well, they probably already have your data. But if you're concerned that people are exploiting sites and your client, and you're not patched, then yeah, that would be a concern. But given the relatively new discovery of this, yes, it was in January, and it was until March, I believe, before the OpenSSL group raised the level of concern about this particular problem from, I think it was a low or medium up to a high, and that was mostly because of the number of servers out there that had this problem. I think because it was relatively new and patched fairly quickly, at least on the server side and your desktop side, I think you're probably okay. Now, what we're probably going to talk about next is a lot of the mobile clients, and that's where we might have more issues. And so for those,
I was just going to segue into the mobile.
Yes, I'm trying to
stuff.
move us in that.
So yeah, I mean, yes, all the browsers I believe are fixed. So that's not a worry, but the one worry is that mobile apps on Android and iOS devices. According to this article here, which is dated March 17th, and I think has to do with the researchers, they found 1,228 Android apps with 1 million or more downloads were vulnerable, and 771 of the top 14,079 iOS apps were susceptible. And basically, this is when they had an affected crypto library and connected to servers that offered weak 512-bit encryption keys. So that's a concern. I mean, that really is. And I mean, I was talking to you, Keith, right before we did this about these applications, and I was kind of wondering why essentially the apps are allowed to use their own TLS implementation instead of using a device-specific one that could essentially be patched by Apple or Google. I mean, I would think iOS would be Apple would be all for it. They seem to have somewhat of a closed platform and want people to use essentially the APIs provided. So I'm kind of surprised that especially iOS is vulnerable as they are. It surprises me. And as far as I know, they didn't release the name of these apps because they don't want them to be exploited. So you don't know what they are, and I mean, there's ways to check. And I don't know if there's a checker online specifically for iOS or Android apps. There is for web servers and browsers, but I don't know if there's one to check your apps on your phone. So I'm not sure how to know if you're vulnerable or not. It seems like the best thing to do is probably don't do any, banking or whatever from your mobile device. Seems to be the best advice to give at the moment. So it's tricky, and I'm really having a hard time figuring out what to tell people to do, because we don't know what the apps are, and if you don't know what they are, you don't know necessarily when they're fixed, because these apps get updated. Most apps especially the popular ones, get updated all the time, and sometimes they don't tell you why you're getting updated. So
you also bring up another point. Yes, if you're a mobile app developer, you probably want to use the operating system provided libraries for this type of communication, assuming that those libraries are relatively secure and kept up to date. Now the problem is we don't see a lot of updates for mobile devices very frequently. Whether you're on iOS or you're on an Android, there's not a lot of updates that generally come out, even for those devices on the OS level. On the app level, I agree, they're fairly frequent. So why aren't those mobile apps using the built-in libraries, and then why aren't the mobile app OS vendors, are they patching quick enough, I guess, is a good question. So, and that's not always obvious, because sometimes we we have older devices, and the speed at which they provide updates or patches seems rather slow, and eventually they're dropped completely, and then you're stuck.
Yes. Well, Google does. I mean, we can talk about the differences between Google and essentially Apple as far as patching devices. But Google did an interesting thing with their Android operating system in that they separated pretty much all of the I guess the built-in apps and stuff like that from the OS, so they can actually patch, Chrome and the web browser and Google Maps and all that outside of the operating system. You don't have to to wait for your cell phone vendor or whoever deals with your Android implementation to patch your device to get patches for all that stuff. So that's good. I don't know how. I don't have an iPhone or any Apple devices, so I'm not exactly sure how the Apple side works if they have done that. But they seem to be a lot. I mean, they seem to be. I mean, it's Apple. You have an Apple device, and Apple updates seem to come out somewhat regularly. But again, if you have an old device, then Apple has pretty much said if your device is older than 2.5 years, then you're not going to be getting updates.
True, but that's also true on the Android side too. If you're running the vendor-provided operating system, yeah, it's Android, but you still are running, KitKat, and we're waiting on Lollipop, right? So even in the Android universe, there's some of that as well. Now you're right; they are separating some of the components out. Like I got an update for something that was new, for me at least. The Android system WebView actually showed up in Google Play as an update, and I assume it is a security update. It basically says web content for apps powered by Chrome. So in Lollipop, that's what they've done. They've replaced the standard system browser libraries with a Chrome-based one, and then are updating that separately. So when there are security issues, they can fix those a little more quickly. Now the question I have is, does that contain the SSL library? Or is that, so if I wrote an app, is that part of this update, does that cover the SSL libraries I might use on my app to make connections to the backend?
Well, yeah, and that's where the question comes in. And I'm guessing that depending on what you use to develop your apps, is how the depends on how TLS is implemented within the app. So if you use a standard Google framework or Apple framework or whatever, then you probably use one implementation, and if you use another one, you might use a different framework. So I think it depends highly. I mean, it's obviously not everyone uses the same framework, or we'd say all apps are vulnerable or no apps are vulnerable. So that's obviously not true. So I think I don't know if this will change the way things are done. Probably not. But I mean I find it a concern, and I find this whole vulnerability interesting because it's obviously been around for a long time.
Right.
And
the fact that we no longer needed the export grade cipher suites was fine, but the fact that they were still there decades later, and
I mean they're still there. They're still there. I mean, if you download, for example, Apache Web Server, if you get the Apache Web Server, or just OpenSSL, I guess I think they're still there.
They're still there, right? But the correction fixes the man in the middle thing, where it tries to force you to use the lower ones. Yes, they are still there. Yes, you can probably manually select them. This just prevents this from, instead of choosing the highest grade crypto cipher suite, into choosing the lowest one. That fixes that problem.
I mean, I part of me wonders, why are they even still there? If we don't need them, why even have them? But
and the standard answer is backwards compatibility.
Yeah.
Which isn't always a great answer.
Yeah, I think that's been. I think we've talked about other vulnerabilities where that was the answer, and we've decided, like TLS or SSL2, SSL version 2,
Right.
as an
Yeah,
example.
why was
and
it
version
there?
3. Why was that?
Older web browser.
And Chrome has chose, or Google has chose to not support it anymore. So.
Yeah, SSL v2 has been gone for a while.
And
SSL
V3, I think,
is gone from most things.
Yeah,
now.
I think most things have taken out 3 as well. So, yeah, and that was fairly recent.
Yeah, well, this last fall. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
so.
what's interesting is there's still a lot of apps, and a lot of them or a few, I should say, not a lot, but a few from Microsoft in particular that I know are still using SSL v3, and there's no TLS option yet. So a lot of their mobile clients to connect to, like Exchange, things like that.
Yeah, so. and this is something I think you mentioned when you were talking about the encryption key. Well, we're talking about we were talking about a 512-bit encryption key, which can be cracked in. They said 7 hours on like an Amazon cluster, which costs about $100 to crack a key. So now I think the good standard today is 1024-bit or even 2048-bit keys.
Right.
And for people who don't know, pretty much each bit you add to the bits takes twice the time, essentially, to crack the key. So we're not talking about doubling the key.
It's doubling.
Yeah, we're not talking about now instead of $100 it would cost $200. Now it would cost it would be
millions,
probably considered not possible with current technology.
Exactly. Yeah, you'd be waiting a long time for that to finish.
So and then going 2048-bit is just I think they said the universe will probably be gone before that's crackable with the current technology. So yeah, that's and that has been I think I don't know what a lot of places are using now, but I think when I get keys they're 2048-bit.
On the like server side keys you're talking about? Yeah,
I think so.
Might as well.
I think that's what they are. I mean,
given
sure that's what my
hardware acceleration, the speed of processors, there's really not a downside to using those higher bits.
Yeah.
Looking a long time ago, it was, but our processors do a much better job of doing cryptographic operations. Some of it built into hardware these days, the AES being a good example, and the most modern Intel processors. So they're doing it in hardware, so it's very fast.
Right, and Google is at 2048 bits. So it seems like if it's good enough for Google, then it's probably what we should be using. So okay, so anything else to talk about related to this?
Yeah, just make sure you're updated. I mean, our usual advice is make sure you're updated, that you've got the latest versions of software, the latest versions of your operating systems on your desktops, your servers, and your mobile devices. And if you're one of those unfortunate ones that have an unsupported mobile device, you might want to look at an alternative firmware option, CyanogenMod or something like that, where they're still integrating those bug fixes. They're putting in a lot more of the security features into those older devices that the manufacturer no longer supports. So that's another option to look at, although that requires a bit of technical knowledge to do.
Yeah, and if you're using a mobile app, then keep your eye on the updates up to your apps. Make sure you keep them updated, because if you do have a vulnerable one, I'm hoping that they will get updated so this vulnerability is fixed. So I mean, and it sounds to me like they could fix it without doing anything to your device, because they could just fix the server that it connects to. So they wouldn't necessarily even have to update the app on your phone to fix the problem. They would just have
Yeah.
they have to either update the app or they have to update the server that it connects to. So you may not even get an update for it to be fixed. So be diligent, I guess, is the
One way to put it.
yeah. All right. Well, I think we've gone over that, and we'll get the articles posted when we post this podcast to the site. And any last words?
No, I think we've covered it.
All right. Well, thanks to Keith Watson. I'm Preston Wiley, and keep your eyes on privacy.